Right on, right on. All right, well, with that, we'll go ahead and get started because we're recording for our YouTube page. So thanks everybody for being here. So for the record, this is the fall spring segment of the Pro Seminar series. Got it. Thank you all for being here. What's that?
Tried to trick us.
Yeah. With the eclipse, I guess I can throw all sorts of things at you. Thanks everybody for being here. We're getting 3 more meetings of this just until we get to the end of the semester. The next 2 we'll have virtual speakers, but we'll still have this room. And then our final one that will close out will be an in-person speaker, much as we have today. We are joined by Dr. Christopher Willoughby here from the Department of Interdisciplinary Gender and Ethnic Studies right here at UNLV. One of the nice things I think about the Pro Seminar talks, and forgive me if you've heard me say similar things before, it's nice, it's an opportunity for us to kind of take the pulse of the greater discipline of anthropology and all its subfields at any given moment, so we can get people coming from archaeology, bioart, forensics, and whatnot. It's also a nice opportunity to tiptoe outside of the field of anthropology and to see what's going on in some of the adjacent disciplines that also happen to overlap with some of the things that are directly relevant to the history of our discipline. We have that advantage here today with Dr. Willoughby, and it's also nice to sometimes not have to tiptoe outside the UNLV community, but we also have people that are right here in our own backyard doing this kind of work. And so today is no exception. So with that, a bit of an intro here for our speaker. Our speaker today is again, Dr. Christopher Willoughby, Assistant Professor in the Department of Interdisciplinary Gender and Ethnic Studies right here at UNLV. He holds an MA and PhD in history from Tulane University. Prior to coming to UNLV, he served in a variety of visiting fellow and professor positions, including University of Pennsylvania and Pitzer College. Pennsylvania might have been more research-oriented fellowship, I would suspect. Yeah. But Pitzer, not to be dismissed.
Great teaching gig.
Yeah, there you go. All right, and a good part of the country to be in for the most part. At the risk of oversimplifying his work, Dr. Willoughby's research explores the historical intersections of medicine, racism, and slavery in the United States. And Dr. Willoughby pursues these interlocking research themes in a very thorough manner in his book, Masters of Health, Racial Science and Slavery in U.S. Medical Schools, published in 2022 on the University of North Carolina Press. His writings have also appeared in various peer-reviewed journals, including Medical History, American Journal of Public Health, and the Journal of Southern History. I myself first became aware of Dr. Willoughby's work a few years ago. He contributed a short but insightful piece to the History of Anthropology Review concerning the medical and racial legacies of the now infamous Samuel G. Morton Skull Collection, which I'm sure a lot of folks here are familiar with. Selfishly, as a managing editor of that publication, I would highly recommend that you all check out Dr. Willoughby's piece, very insightful. The number of people kind of doing, I guess, history of anthropology, it's not a big pool of folks, but it does seem to be growing the last several years, but it's small enough that when any 2 of them are sort of anywhere near each other, usually people send out smoke signals. So shortly after Dr. Willoughby was hired over the summer, like I very quickly got emails from colleagues of colleagues mentioning that, oh, you should reach out to him. And as I saw the name, I thought, I already know this dude. Like, I don't know him, but I know his work. So it's a great opportunity to actually have him here at UNLV. The research that Dr. Willoughby has done, that scholarship is definitely pulls together a lot of seemingly disparate historical threads, but it's gained a number of sources of support financially coming from such hallowed halls as Harvard University, the National Science Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, and though I love this organization, the horribly titled the Consortium for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. Both long, unwieldy, and they refuse to use the Oxford comma. But nevertheless, they do great work and they sponsor great sort of work that operates at the intersections of the historical and social sciences. And that is not also a comprehensive view of the CV, just a little snippet of it. Without further ado, the talk today is titled Racial Science, I'll blame it on the eclipse, Early Anthropology and the Plantation Health in the Antebellum United States. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Christopher Willoughby.
So thank you so much for having me, and sorry, just to make sure I get timer reset. I'm not reading, so if this goes on way too long, it's my fault. If this takes 5 minutes, it's also my fault. Thanks so much for having me. I felt inspired to try and create a new argument out of some old research. And one of the things that, as Nick pointed out, I'm kind of a historian of anthropology, but not necessarily someone who titles their articles that. So I focus on these kind of early human remains collections, debates over racial science. This is really, of course, where anthropology will emerge out of, and like a lot of different disciplines. But today I wanted to think about early anthropology and its actual relationship to the other part of my research, which is the health of enslaved people. And so thinking about how the work racial science does in society, and potentially, I think that hopefully will leave some food for thought for, so often we deal with medicine as well. These kind of disciplines, once they have their own departments, are really distinctive, but in a lot of ways before the Civil War, before the professionalization of academia in a lot of ways, medicine was the home department for most of the sciences. And anthropology very much fits in that. So I think, so I don't necessarily have this like a very clear point in that, but that's like where my head's at right now, and thinking about this interrelationship between anthropological arguments about the origins of racial difference, but also the politics of health and slavery in the first half of the 19th century. So I'm going to make 3 arguments today, and these are generally speaking the order that I'll be going in, to try and answer the bigger question of how did the plantation system inform the growth of anthropology in this period. And this is, once again, I'm stopping at 1860, before there's a Department of Anthropology in existence. So, you know, certain people might even question whether or not this is anthropology. But I'm going to start by looking at first kind of broad political context. And I think this periodization and specific periodization will be very critical to understanding why the US is somewhat different than other slaveholding societies and empires in this period. But that as the institution of slavery began to face serious opposition from an abolitionist movement, ironically, and this is a different timeline in a lot of ways, not completely unique in the Americas, but somewhat unique, slavery began to rapidly expand in the United States, versus in a lot of empires began to contract, or I should say, began to be less supported by governments. So responding to this increased scrutiny in this period, physicians who were almost all of the people writing things that we would think of as proto-anthropology, racial science, they embraced racial science in medical education, and they train physicians to think racially, but from a specifically racial science and polygenetic framework that I'll get into later. And just to very quickly say, polygenesis is this theory that each human race is a different species created in distinct locations and correlated to different environments. And then finally, Western expansion, specifically the expanding, for this case, in this issue of plantation history, the expansion of plantations in the South, in the Deep South, particularly in those Western states, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, will, and I should say Tennessee, because that's where my example is going to come from, will facilitate the expropriation of course, Native American lands, but also of Native American remains. And so these are these 3 kind of critical dynamics of just as slavery is expanding, we have more scrutiny of the health problems of enslavement. Second, medical science will embrace this racial science framework that partially will split off into physical anthropology. And then finally, the actual remains studied to create some of the science will come from the partially at least from the expanding plantation districts. So to give some quick context on politics, so you know, there's a lot of been written about whether or not the US was pro-slavery at its founding or anti-slavery. We just discussed this in my intro to African American Studies class. And I would say that, you know, of course, the Constitution does facilitate the expansion of slavery by, in many ways, allowing it to exist legally. But one of the things that I think we often find confusing are people like Thomas Jefferson, who are deeply racist, but in some way give some sort of anti-slavery sentiment. So before the invention of Whitney's cotton gin in the early 1790s, there is an accurate sense in most of the places where slavery exists, the tobacco regions, it's really dying out in the United States. And that's a true dynamic. The first abolition society in the Atlantic world is in Pennsylvania in the 1770s. So there is a genuine abolition sentiment that's gestating in the Anglo-Atlantic in particular, of which the United States is a part of, in this early period. But then when the gin is invented, cotton will, of course, be the kind of fundamental boom of the Southern economy. expanding into the states of the West. It's usually like the second or third sons of planters from the East Coast who will take, around 20 enslaved people with them, found their own cotton plantation in these sites. So you have simultaneously, for the first time really in North American history, it's becoming the center of the world of the slave economy. Yet, it also has a dynamic, vibrant, and growing abolitionist movement. So what will happen is that there needs to be new defenses of slavery in this period, and polygenesis and racial science will partially fill that void. And not just, I'm not an expert in the history of history, the history of sociology, but you can make very similar arguments about a lot of different emerging disciplines and how they provided a bulwark for racial thinking. And then finally, and this is critical for the issue of disease and health conditions on plantations, which will get increased scrutiny in this period, rapid transportation in the form of the steamship and the train will create an age of pandemics, essentially, in the long 19th century, that while of course there were pandemics before this, they just did not move as quickly. One thinks about medieval plague, it takes place over centuries, that pandemic does. So, technically you could say it's not really a pandemic because it doesn't reach the Americas, but that's pandemic of the known world. So, additional context, in this period, so the first medical school was founded in 1765, University of Pennsylvania. There are only a handful in all of the 18th century. But by 1860, the starting of the Civil War, there are more than 50 medical schools. Only 200 MDs are produced in all of the 18th century in the US. And in the last 2 decades before the Civil War, there are close to 30,000. Black people are actively excluded from medical education in this period. Here we see Dr. James McCune Smith, the first African-American to receive an MD, but he got his MD at the University of Glasgow. The first Black person, I should say, admitted to an American medical school at Dartmouth was a Liberian immigrant. And I don't know if it was an official condition, but certainly an expectation that he would return to Liberia after completing his medical education. That was Samuel F. McGill. Third, in the 1840s and 1850s, polygenesis, this will briefly become the central framework for understanding human difference, right before the publication of Darwin's On the Origin of the Species. And I should say central framework in medical and academic circles, not amongst the average American. And then finally, in this period prior to the professionalization of anthropology, I would argue the medical school was the closest thing to an institutional home for early anthropologists and anthropological thinking. But we're going to come back to that later, and I'm going to very quickly walk you through some overviews of the dynamic relationship between slavery and healthcare that I think incentivizes these physicians to engage in racial theorizing and really be a kind of foundation for the dissemination of early theories of racial difference. So this abolitionist movement and its expanding press, once again, in the 18th century, there are very few newspapers in the United States, very few academic journals. By the 1850s, there are medical journals in New Orleans, multiples of them, just one city. There are rural medical journals in Lexington, Kentucky. Newspapers, of course, even more prolific and more affordable and accessible. So to some extent, and particularly in the Northeast, notions of Black people's poor health on plantations and their poor conditions are getting disseminated. Physicians, of course, when they practice in the South, do not work for their patients. They work for the enslaver. So they have a vested interest in working, and that means, of course, not fundamentally criticizing the foundations of the slave system. And you'll see this very often, is that they will, in discussions of poor health on plantations, actually discuss material conditions that cause ill health, but then they'll very quickly sidestep into victim blaming in some way, or into kind of environmental determinist arguments. And why is this? Well, it was no mystery. These students knew that slavery was the foundation of their economy, but also, and this is partially true and partially evidence of the extreme overvaluing of their own importance that will define Southerners into the Civil War and their own destruction. But he says, without the enslaved people's aid, the spindles and looms of Manchester, of Lowell, and all the large manufactories must in a great measure remain idle. The fertile plantations of the South and West must go uncultivated, and our extensive forests must remain, as they now are, the storehouses of malaria. So in short, students are very explicitly seeing their work on plantations in light of a broader Atlantic and global economy. Of course, these conditions are not neutral, they're not natural. There's a saying, and people who study natural disasters, there's no such thing as a natural disaster. And epidemics on plantations, while you could certainly claim some sort of ignorance, were also facilitated by this new world. So in the 19th century, we have our waves of the first cholera epidemics. Cholera had long been endemic to parts of South Asia, but through this new world of trade, colonialism, imperialism, that's really more tightly knit together in the 19th century, cholera begins to spread around the world. There are earlier epidemics that don't really reach North America in the 18 teens. The first one to hit the South and North America in general is 1832 to 1833, then again in 1848, 49, 50. And these epidemics will race up the Mississippi River. This is actually a picture of Mississippi River plantations. You can see how here's the river, here are these plantations that all line up directly onto the river. For the most part, how disease would have been communicated would have been through small flotilla crafts, not these steamers that are stopping in bigger towns and cities. But these epidemics could be devastating, sudden, and horrifying. So there would be, you'd see this in letters. We've heard the pandemic, or we've heard cholera is in Bayou Lafourche. We hope it doesn't come to our neighborhood. You even would see, in this case, C.H. Stone, as a physician writing in the New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal. He notes how cholera devastated this plantation, but left the plantation adjacent unharmed. So it's both very similar to these kind of urban epidemics, but also different because you have compact populations together, but isolated within the larger community. So it kind of would go in a strange hits here, hits there. But they would often blame the enslaved people for their illness. There was a very famous physician, Samuel Cartwright, who became known for racial science and the disease tryptomania, which supposedly caused slaves to run away. He actually engaged in an elaborate, what he called ceremony that was supposed to reproduce African witchcraft to exhume the panic from the environment on one plantation with dysentery, because he argued that the panic was worse than the disease. Of course, that's a very convenient argument for someone trying to explain why it's not their fault that this illness is raging. So in short, enslaved people are experiencing epidemics of urban international diseases that are caused by this trade in cotton goods, peoples. Also, we don't tend to think of industrialism as having a health effect on plantations. And I don't want to get too much detail into this, but there is a significant increase in mechanization on the plantation in this period. Cotton gins themselves are a new machine that are highly dangerous. The steam-powered sugar mill will make milling sugar more dangerous, and it will lead to an increasing rate in amputations on plantations. And I should say that, just to be clear, I don't think plantation slavery was any less healthy in this period than beforehand. These are new wrinkles that make it different. But life expectancies were very bad in the 18th century as well, but they're getting a new type of scrutiny. That is in some ways the most important thing, is when we're thinking about why does anthropology have a kind of roots and origins in thinking about health and race, it's more to do with the discourse. Slavery was incredibly unhealthy from 1500 to 1800. There just wasn't an abolitionist movement. There wasn't an abolitionist press until the early 19th century. So additionally, enslaved people faced endemic occupational health issues. proponent of scientific management, Thomas Affleck, told readers in the New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal, and this man was a proponent of slavery. He hoped to improve it. So I think we can take his word in the sense that he's not going to criticize slavery for the sake of trying to end it. He's criticizing it to try and improve it. He says, in the process of picking cotton, proponent of scientific management, the enslaved wielded upon their heads a load of 100 to 150 pounds, and they dropped that load off once midday, reaccumulate enough cotton to about 100, 150 pounds by the end of the second period of the day, and drop that off, pressing upon their skull, neck, and backbone. And when the muscles are relaxed by fatigue, cannot but be injurious. Additionally, the kind of stooping to pick up the buds of the plant was known to cause back injuries as well. Malnutrition was, of course, rampant. Enslaved women, it was not uncommon for enslaved women to have rickets, which led to an increase in gynecological problems, particularly in difficult childbirths, many of which were demanded and incentivized by enslavers. So in short, my point is that racial science and proto-anthropology emerged in a critical context when, and became much more popular when the enslaved's health was under increased scrutiny, and we know a lot more about it. And the average person would have known a lot more about it compared to them beforehand, unless they lived in a plantation district. And that gets us to the medical school. And so just now to pull back for a moment to the 18th century, this might be, probably is for some of you, a little bit familiar information, but in the 18th century is when you really have this debate over polygenesis and monogenesis become formally academic in a certain way. There had been a papal junta in the 16th century debating polygenesis. Basically, when they discovered Native Americans, really, that caused some serious questions about the biblical origin of humans. And so it will lead to this papal debate. But in the 18th century, the naturalists, the people we think of today as kind of creating the race concept in different ways, will begin to make their claims. And most critically, and I don't think is very often connected, almost all of these naturalists, and all of the ones I highlighted here, were trained physicians. Carolus Linnaeus, the Comte de Buffon, Petrus Camper, who invents the measurement of the facial angle, is an anatomy professor in the 18th century. And they begin describing bodies and describing differences as a way of categorizing people into different racial groups. Now, once again, when Linnaeus does this in the mid-18th century, there's really not much of an abolitionist movement. Linnaeus himself believes in a very malleable human body that can change through reproducing, frankly, with other people from different backgrounds. Buffon is similar, as is Camper is really not the racial essentialist of the 19th century. There are a few important polygenists in this period, but they're really on the sidelines in this moment. And it's not until the late Antebellum period where they will become very prominent. But that being said, physicians, naturalists are already starting to make anatomical arguments for racial difference. This is an image from the British physician Charles White's book, an account of the regular gradation in man and in different animals and vegetables. Say it's the first pro-polygenesis book that's deeply anatomical in its arguments. And here is this image. This is supposedly the European high arched feet, and these are the African flat feet here. So we're starting to see an anatomical argument that in some ways mirrors the troubling history of physical anthropology, or prehistory at least. Then the first half of the 19th century, though, support for polygenesis grew precipitously, to the point to where by the middle 1840s and 1850s, medical school faculty are pretty routinely teaching this debate, and many of them are weighing in support of polygenesis. So from Harvard to the University of Louisiana, Antebellum medical schools employ polygenists. One notable case, has anybody ever heard of Joseph Leidy? There's a biography of him that's called The Last Man Who Knew Everything. He wrote 500 articles. He was a paleontologist. He discovered the parasite that causes trichinosis. He was also the anatomy professor at the University of Pennsylvania. There's still a Leidy lab to him. And he's not really known for his association with racial science, but he did teach it. He told his students at Penn that there are more differences between lions and tigers than white and black people. And yet, of course, he says, no naturalist ever lumped together lions and tigers as the same species. So he's very overtly teaching his students that anatomical differences justify grouping each human race into distinctive species. And these students will learn this. They're 50% at the University of Pennsylvania are Southern, 50% are Northern. And this will also, in ways that I can't fully get into for time, inform how medical education approaches race. You're marketing to get Southerners to go to the North. So Northerners get a pretty Southern education as well. They also will argue, and this is critical, so the anatomy tends to frame and essentialize the categories. Leidy himself will abandon the notion that reproduction is a definitional kind of aspect of speciation, and instead say it's just anatomy. It's just these kind of coherent anatomical forms. And he is also one of the first converts to Darwin in the US, and Darwin writes him a very nice letter thanking him for his support. But the other critical part of polygenesis is the notion that each race is suited for a different environment, that Black folk are suited to work on plantations in the South, and this will infect Southern politics as well. And here's a quote from Josiah Nott. Nott wrote, his most famous book would be Types of Mankind with George Glidden. And this is from his other very large racial science text, Indigenous Races of the Earth, and he did self-style as an anthropologist as well in this period. He said, my favorite research discipline is anthropology. And he says, and apologies for this dated language, the Negro is the native of the hottest region on the globe, where he goes naked in the scorching rays of the sun and can lie down and sleep on the ground at a temperature of at least 150 degrees of Fahrenheit, where the white man would die in a few hours. And while the degenerate tropical descendants of the whites are regenerated by transportation to cold parallels of the temperate zone, experience abundantly proves that in America, the Negro steadily deteriorates, becomes exterminated north of about 40 degrees north latitude. So they're arguing that if Black folks are freed and go north, they'll die off. This is said also in more Black and white terms elsewhere. But the general point that they're making and that they're teaching students is that slavery is defined by anatomical features. It's not only appropriate on a kind of biological determinism level, but morally justified. There will be opponents of polygenesis who will argue that slavery is the multi-thousand potentially year tutelage needed to kind of civilize African descendants into being proper, not just kind of technical equals, but actual equals in civilization. So that's the other thing that I get into my book, is that there are some meaningful critics of this, but they're few and far between. And many of them who disagree on the technical aspects are pretty white supremacists in their actual ideas. But at the medical school, anthropology was treated as a kind of almost specialization. Medical students wrote their dissertations about the origins of racial difference, anatomical differences among races, and health consequences of it. Medical schools also began to acquire large museums with racialized skull collections. This is the Warren Anatomical Museum at the Harvard Medical School. This is the mid-19th century location, so some of it for some period before the Civil War and after. And Harvard had 150 quote unquote national skulls collected partially by John Collins Warren. They also acquired the Boston Phrenological Society skull collection, which you can actually see here lining this banister are all the phrenological skulls. students debated whether they had multiple or shared origin in their theses. Almost all agreed that people of African descent were healthier in the South. Medical school anatomy museums had human remains organized by race. And students also, almost with just a few exceptions, I actually counted them, and like 16 out of 17 students agreed that Black people were immune to malaria. I think it's like 17 out of 20 who wrote about yellow fever, where there is no genetic protection from yellow fever. Malaria, it's not a racial trait, but there are some protections from malaria. Yellow fever did not affect Black people as much. Tetanus, which of course was rampant on plantations, was supposed to be caused by innate biology, not the lack of footwear on plantations.
Yeah.
So you can see this is actually a page of a medical school textbook from the 1850s, assigned at the University of Louisville and at Tulane University. You can see similar images from the medical textbooks produced by University of Pennsylvania professor William Horner and his successor, who I've already discussed, Joseph Leidy. At Harvard, we know students learned how to use a craniometer for themselves. They learned how to measure skulls from Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., the anatomy professor, in the second half of the 19th century. And this science got picked up by politicians. So during the antebellum period, white Southern defenders of slavery transitioned from describing slavery as a regrettable necessity to a positive good. So I mentioned that this is not a defense of Thomas Jefferson, not a fan overall, but when he at times kind of described slavery in negative terms or foresaw its end, I think to some extent we can take him on his word. He was a tidewater tobacco planter in a region where slavery was kind of dying, or it appeared to be in the 1780s. But by the 1830s, cotton is the center of the Southern economy. Sugar is the center of the Mississippi River economy. These things are some of the biggest raw produced goods, most important ones in the global economy. And they're not particularly interested in talking about all the negative necessity of slavery, especially when there are people who say, let's get rid of it. So Southern politicians began to argue slavery is a positive good. Most notably would be John C. Calhoun, who we know talked about Samuel Morton's research on the floor of the Senate, but also one of my favorite monsters, I guess, Senator James Henry Hammond of South Carolina, in an 1853 essay. And this was, so in the 1850s, Southerners began to consider and advocate for reopening the slave trade. Had been closed since the first decade of the century. They began to advocate for the conquest of parts of Latin America, particularly Central America, Cuba, and even Brazil. There actually were two independent expeditions, so not officially sponsored by the US government, that did invade Honduras and Cuba, but were rebuffed. And we might also note that the Mexican-American War, of course, was a gigantic land grab that was used for, essentially fomented by, you could make a pretty strong case, Anglo-Texas slaveholders that pushed for that to happen. So in this 1853 essay, Senator James Henry Hammond will argue that labor was essential to the expansion of the Southern way of life, slavery, and that the South needed to annex Cuba, Mexico, and Brazil. And he argued that it would protect poor whites from exploitation. And perhaps it was from exploitation from this man, the sociologist George Fitzhugh. So it's called book he wrote called Sociology for the South. He wrote another book called Cannibals All. He was a trenchant and prescient critic of free labor with the largest blind spots for slave labor you can imagine. So he actually had very good descriptions of why free labor in the North and the industrial cities was exploitative. His solution was enslave all of the poor people. He actually advocated for enslaving whites. So some of this rhetoric, Hammond gave another speech that's very famous in like Southern history circles called the Mudsill speech. Every society needs its mudsill to be stepped on. If we erase the color line, white people will be a part of those people being stepped on. So slavery very overtly gets tied into this racial thinking. And we can especially see it very clearly said. This is very similar to type of language you could actually see in medical student dissertations. In the opening lines of the secession, Declaration of Secession for the Mississippi in 1861, they say, and I'll read this in its entirety, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. And so sentence 3, these products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the black race can bear exposure to the sun, tropical sun. Sounds remarkably similar to what Josiah Nott said. These products have become necessities of the world, and a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. That blow has long been aimed at the institution and was at the point of reaching its consummation. There is no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition or a dissolution of the Union, whose principles have been subverted to work out our ruin. So very clearly connecting both the economic or perceived economic reality to this bio or environmental determinist notions of health of Black folk. And this history does intersect with Native Americans in some critical ways. I don't have time to get into it here, but one really big difference is that there isn't a lot of hemming and hawing about where Native Americans are healthiest, because physicians aren't going to practice on Native Americans. So I think that's where you also see a very applied approach. But on the other hand, they do invent other theories about Native Americans that are less have to do with medicine, but are nonetheless produced by medical doctors. So this is John Collins Warren. I couldn't help, I was rereading a letter when I was putting this together. He starts a letter saying, I'm so gratified by you remembering my craniological wishes. In short, he put out all these letters to New England expats who are taking academic jobs in all the new universities and colleges being created around the country and asking them to collect skulls for him. Warren became a polygenist. He had a pet theory about Native Americans that in some ways is correct, in some ways really racist. I mean, probably in all ways really racist, a little bit here and there are correct. But he argued there were multiple waves of people who came across the Bering Land Bridge. I think that's, I'm not an anthropologist or an archaeologist, but I believe that's correct, broadly speaking. Yes, getting a thumbs up. But that the people who built all the civilizations that, of course, Europeans wiped out right when they got here, those were from a pre-European period, and a second wave of Native Americans came in. This is before, this is his theory, and conquered, these were inferior Native American. I mean, these were inferior Asians, I guess, who conquered, for the most part, wiped out the kind of civilization builders as he saw it, because if these people built civilizations, how can we have expropriated all of their lands and wiped them out? So you can see this justification for a man living in Massachusetts, 2.5 centuries out from the peak, or a century and a half away from the Pequot War, trying to think of some good explanations for why it's perfectly fine for him to live there. But his theory is that the people who compress their skulls in certain ways, flat-headed Indians, as he called them, or Peruvian skulls, were these original civilization builders. And so Harvard collected as many of them as they could find under his leadership. And with the help of enslaved laborers, planter naturalists, we know this happened further east as well, excavated Native American remains from their plantations. And in one example, the wife of the President Holly of Transylvania University, that's who he wrote this letter to, thanking her for remembering his craniological wishes. She stays on a plantation in a town called Clarksville, Tennessee, or roughly west of Nashville, about an hour today. And there's a whole Native American mound. I think we can suspect these are Mississippian peoples, but not 100% sure. And they offer Warren the entire collection if he comes and cures the man's cataracts. The elderly person, he does not. He just gets one skull and moves on with his life. But the point is that these plantations are ways of opening up the lands that will, of course, begin to fill the Smithsonian, begin to fill, Harvard's ultimate collection of more than 20,000 sets of human remains. And then, almost done, I have two more slides. So Jeffries Wyman also relied on enslaved labor when he helped build the collections of the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard. And Wyman was a trained physician, a Boston Brahmin. He's a professor at Hampton-Sydney College. I think Asia Lanz talked about him a decent amount in her presentation. But Wyman will go to Suriname in 1857, still a slave society under Dutch rule. And he'll stay in plantation after plantation. Enslaved people will find specimens for him of certain animals. He'll end up, and I actually did a collaborative article with the anthropologist Richard Price on what I found, but he'll end up in the Samaka Maroon community, one of the few kind of white people in the mid-19th century to spend more than a day interacting with these folk. And he'll try and take a sacred vine from their community, but ultimately they play him really well. And he wants to go further and further into Suriname and deeper into their community. And they're like, there's some people who are to take you, just need another week. Just need every week, it was another week. And then he just turns around, goes about 2 villages into this larger society. But the point being, Wyman, during his trip in Suriname, like I said, a Boston Brahmin himself, he'll produce racial science, which I don't have much time to get into here, but he'll, in his diary and his letters, constantly comment on how suited the enslaved people are for this tropical climate. Now, obviously, he's missing a lot. Jeffries Wyman cannot swim. Jeffries Wyman is wearing, probably a 19th century version of what I'm wearing today. The enslaved people, he's like, they just walk around with remarkably little clothing. They're swimming all the time. Like he will note these things. These are obviously really great management techniques for the weather of Suriname. But what does he say? He says that it is their kind of protection from the sun. He also will go on plantations, writing letters back to family members. He'll say, the enslaved do, quote, nearly as they please. They're, quote, very happy and jolly set. And they can all be fed for the cost of 40 cents per week. So it's a pretty glowing depiction of enslavement. Ironically, when he's at Hampton-Sydney in Virginia, I don't know if it's being in somebody else's colony, he's actually much more critical of slavery, but he's bringing back these anecdotes that will feed this already built narrative that Black people's anatomy suits them or defines them as a different species, suited for the tropics, healthy under enslavement. So, I hope that makes sense and came together pretty well. So, and this is not like, anthropology is a specific evil that caused all of the problems. I think it really is actually like an academia-wide story we need to start telling better. But academic disciplines, emerging in the 19th century, like anthropology, were distinctly shaped by a contentious politics of slavery that required more and more elite folks to say that race was real. That was also, of course, tied to native dispossession, especially when we think of the collection of remains that were used to supposedly prove this science. Second, this race concept that really takes hold and takes shape in this period is sadly alive and well today. I mean, I think actually anthropology is doing a lot more work than other disciplines to end that. But it obscures how we understand health disparities, much like it obscured them in the 19th century. A discussion of shoes would have been more useful than supposedly inherited traits when talking about tetanus. And I think a discussion of pollution would be more useful to discussing child onset asthma today in the disproportionate rates amongst African Americans than some to be found gene that is actually causing it. To be fair, to note, I do not believe there is a gene causing asthma disparities, at least not one that can be tracked to African Americans. And finally, as scholars have argued, these origins for anthropologies draw attention to a really big mess we're all in as people who deal with human remains, who talk about them, of, you know, hundreds of thousands potentially of people's remains are now maybe even millions in museums all around the world. I think, you know, there are some legitimate academic reasons to have remains. There are also a lot of illegitimate ones. And I think I don't have an answer for this. I go back and forth all the time on like kind of a complete decolonization or but I'll just say that's what I see as the kind of big implications of the story are, you know, the race concept and, you know, the skeletons in all of our institutions. So thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to your questions.
We have nearly 15 minutes, so I think we can resolve all of those final issues that you were leaving us on at that time period. So if folks have questions or comments or thoughts.
Hi, yeah, so my question was, by the way, really great presentation. I very much enjoyed it. One of my research specialties is eugenics, and I'm curious to see how a lot of people connect eugenics to immigration issues and class issues, but I'm interested to see how scientific racism and the abolition of slavery, how you think maybe connected to the idea of improving humans, pressure from the abolition of slavery and like perfecting humans, and of course conveniently white humans.
Yeah, I mean that's it. So I think, you know, it's like a lot of these topics, there are a lot of continuities, but it's important to also appreciate the differences. And I think what changes so much is the political context. You will have the turn of the 20th century when folks, I guess they're kind of taking this logic and turning it on its head in some ways, arguing that now that African Americans aren't enslaved, they're going to die out. There's obviously that didn't seem very plausible based on the evidence available at the turn of the 20th century, but you know, Madison Grant makes the argument anyways. But so I think what's really important to understand in context of eugenics is, I think where the eugenics storyline fails us a lot, or storyline or narrative, is that it makes racial thinking in health, medicine, and the sciences seem like a very discrete history. One with a very clear rise in the early 20th century. And then, of course, you know, after the fever dream of Nazism, oh yeah, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, sure, that went on for 27 years after we figured out about the Nazis. But, you know, after that, everybody realized race was illegitimate. There was a great UN statement, and we moved on. And I think when we look at this longer history, when you even look back, as I do in my book for a moment, at the 17th century, on how ideas of health, race, Native Americans were being used to justify the kind of genocide and depopulation through genocide, that it's a much deeper and longer history. And so I think that's, I don't know if this necessarily answers your question, but I see that as what telling this story we need to do. It's something where I leave the book following people like Joseph Leidy and Oliver Wendell Holmes, and note that they are professors longer after the Civil War than they were beforehand. And they don't just erase their views, and they don't just change. I actually can trace that in their lecture notes. They adopt Darwinian theories of causation, yet their craniometry lectures are remarkably similar, which shouldn't be particularly surprising. You know, we know what Hrdlicka is going to do. I'm sure I'm butchering his name, and yeah. So I think that's where I think the politics of slavery. I think one of the interesting things is this moment will put race as a legitimate topic into academia, into particularly kind of biological sciences, and then, you know, physicians in particular are not great historians of themselves. They will forget why this is. They take, like, you know, the biggest problem with the race concept is the race concept, that there are 5 groups with a shared biological background, despite the fact that the history of humans is moving around and mixing with other people. Like it just doesn't, it's bad on its face, but without that kind of scrutiny and with the kind of self-congratulatory narratives of eugenics, it's made it very easy for race to become neutral again almost, and particularly in medicine, not in other disciplines, but I think question.
Yeah, I guess mine was how you frame this in the broader world picture at the time, because this is kind of a particular instance. But as European colonialism went around the world, they did the same thing, right? And it was, in my view, always economically driven. And my reading of the most recent economic history of Antebellum South is that 50% of equity in the South was in slaves. So they had a lot to lose by giving up the slaves. And so they were doing it for the money, which is no big shock, just as the English were doing, colonialism for the money, right? So I wonder how you think it's different, because a lot of these arguments are the same ones that the British and the French made, about people, from the tropics.
So I'll say where I don't think it's actually that different. I think you're right to make those connections. I think where I'm making somewhat of a different argument, broadly speaking, and I hope folks working on the history of medicine in France and Britain will do this as well. But the medical pedagogy component, I think, is at least shown to be different. But I actually, in the book, engaged with that history pretty clearly. I just had an article come out this week on imperialism and race and medical education. So what I think is, it's very similar. It's a part of the same milieu and kind of cultural politics of that period. For example, there's a medical student who sounds a great deal like the racial scientist, polygenist Robert Knox in the 1850s, when he makes the argument that only Central Africa will be the last bastion for non-whites by the end of the 19th century. Like this student is essentially predicting the total wiping out of all kind of inferior races other than Africans. Likewise, somebody like Josiah Knott, Indigenous Races of the Earth, and I have a whole page of the book, is really heavily relying on racial health data from European empires to making comparative arguments. You see a little bit in student writing, comparative arguments about India and the South, not a lot. I talk about it in the article. Doesn't make it in the book because it's just not as big of a theme. They're not as worldly as that, but they're definitely thinking that way. And these medical schools are very overtly also tied into these same networks of imperialism. Harvard will very famously, and it's probably the case of an individual person who gets subjected to science that I focus on the most in my book, will dissect a indigenous South Khoikhoi man who is rented by P.T. Barnum from the colonial government in British South Africa. He comes over to be a part of a kind of, one of those ethnological displays with four other men from Southern Africa, and kills himself 6 months into being in the United States. And Harvard takes his body. Jeffries Wyman writes a whole pamphlet comparing his skeleton to gorillas. So we know that obviously has some imperial connections. How do you get a gorilla skeleton? Better find someone who's going to Africa. But I think you're exactly right. This is all part of a shared culture. I think the way it inhabits American politics, well, it is, that imperialism, that Hammond wanting to conquer Cuba, Brazil, their empire, the Southerners, looks a little different and has different orientations. So they're starting to have the same kind of indigenous questions. And I would say, the US empire is functioning very well in the Mexican-American War. It's a land empire, or it's subsuming those things in a way that is different from empires and making them states. But yeah, I think you're spot on. It's the imperial moment is critical to this. It also allows the Americans to make comparative arguments about people of African descent, which they, of course, will collapse the fact that people of African descent in the Americas pretty different genetic histories by that point. We know than those in Africa. But yeah, I think the point you're making is this is an economic case. I also actually agree with that pretty closely as well. Like, race is the excuse. It's not the reason.
I don't want to interrupt other people.
Sure.
But just, it's interesting. Well, from my perspective, if you the fact that they needed to justify it, I think is historically unusual.
Yeah,
Because if you go back to, I don't know, slavery is like this universal thing throughout human history. If you go back 1,000 years, 500 years, whatever, people never felt like they had to say anything like this. It was just this one moment when people are starting to question the concept of slavery. And then so you have a bunch of people invent sort of, retroactively invent reasons why you could justify it.
yeah, exactly. I mean, because in the early modern period, the justifications for slavery, to the extent they even need to, and you're right, it's much less of a debate. But even when it does come up, it's almost always religious, cultural, like barbarism, stuff like that, body modification. And they're still obviously trying to justify an economic component through some sort of cultural differences. But this notion of hardened races with distinctive biologies, that's where we try to provide people with hope. If humans can uninvent this, maybe we can, or invent this, maybe we can destroy it. But it's for a specific moment. I think it really is forged into a very firm foundation by abolitionism. Unintentional. I mean, obviously abolitionism isn't to blame, but that debate.
It creates the environment in which you have to do that. Because otherwise, I don't know, if you go back to ancient Rome, no one's writing we shouldn't have slaves. And so it's never alleviated a question. Here someone finally says, somebody writes the rights of man, right? And then suddenly it was like, oh, okay, we'll figure out a way to justify it. It's like, it's forcing people to sort of retroactively create these arguments that never existed.
Yeah, I don't want to overstate it, but yeah, I think the main justification people had for buying slaves was they were for sale before this period. Like that, the Nordic people throughout the medieval era were slave raiding the Slavs. It's like, this was the world, and it is disturbing. And the racialization comes when it becomes ethically debatable.
Yeah.
I think that's really well said. Any other questions? I know we're.
Sorry.
No, I really enjoyed it, but I just want to make sure
Selfishly, I'm going to insert a question just because I know we're almost out of time. And forgive me because I think I might have asked you a similar question when you did your spotlight talk in the fall, but on the pedagogy side of it, or the medical schools. So as you kind of mentioned, there's these monogenesis, polygenesis views in the antebellum period. It starts to move more towards polygenesis. And this is just like, very cursory glance at history, but like presumably those students would have been coming from like Judeo-Christian households where maybe biblical story of Genesis, which is monogenesis. How do they react to that especially as like something like On the Origins of the Species starts to percolate in medical school education? Is it just like cognitive dissonance, or do they talk about it? If so, how?
So they do, and they have kind of three approaches. I would say I think this is pretty good. So you have the kind of, and I'll say being an alumnus of this, the kind of new atheist types who are like, I know something that nobody else knows. Everyone else is a fool. I'm willing to look the truth of like natural history. Lyell has told us the world is millions of years old now, and I will look that in the face and I will like abandon my religion in a certain way. And that's really where also a lot of the kind of main theorists go. They even write a song in defense of the book Types of Mankind. Somebody does. I found it. I don't know who wrote it. And it's like Types of Mankind is Goliath and all the Christian mudslingers. And that's what they're slinging mud instead of rocks, are Davids. Like, so it's very much this kind of, we are actually enlightened. Then you have the students who completely reject it out of hand. But even then, very few of them go to the reasonable position that slavery is bad, although, I'm sure it does happen some. But then a lot of people will take the third pseudo-Lamarckian explanation. They don't say they're being Lamarckian, but that, racial differences formed over thousands of years. And these folks who are still on a 6,000-year timeline because they are rejecting Lyell. So racial differences emerged over thousands of years in distinctive climates. Different anatomical formations took place, and there are real anatomical differences. And it'll take thousands of years to civilize the African through slavery. Often is this kind of, so it ends up being they find the least logical, most convenient explanation for their worldview of pro-slavery pro-Christianity, I guess would be all essentially saying that they're anatomically different. This is what probably the most prominent proponent of monogenesis in the US, John Bachman, Reverend. This is essentially the argument he'll make. Anatomical differences are real, took thousands of years to formulate. Yes, white and black people can reproduce, but that doesn't mean we need to end slavery. Like, you know, and that it doesn't mean that there's equality. So he's able to kind of square that circle, and a lot of students do that. But yeah, it is very interesting because they do feel like it is like, you know, YouTube reactions to Richard Dawkins or something like that. But I say alumnus, I did graduate the New Atheists, not still reading Christopher Hitchens all the time. But yeah. Well, thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to be here.
Plus, thank you so much.